Wow. A lot to ponder. I've been taking quite a few notes to try to make some sense of what we've heard tonight. Let me summarize it first before we open to questions, just to help set some context. And bear with me if I don't get the language right or some of the context. And some of the ideas, I think, are incredibly complex. This is a very complex set of issues. What I heard is society has changed. We do have to pay attention to the alt-right. They deserve our attention. Western modernity and the historical nature of change, we've heard about trends, we've heard about declines. We've heard about the liberation and affirmation of identities. We've heard very much about angry white men and all the things that Alan identified as very, very important to the movement. And obviously we heard how it relates specifically to Trump and the Republican Party. I would like to talk about that in the Canadian context, perhaps Alan too, and how that's affecting the Canadian context of politics beyond Kelly Leach. He's no longer there, but I suspect the party still plays with that. Then we've heard about the history of the alt-right in Canada. And we've heard about Montreal as being a center. Yep. So still is a center of the alt-right and that movement. We've heard about the evolution and the trends of that movement in Canada and also within Manitoba. We've heard about the existing conditions, the causes that lead to the alt-right being formed as a movement. We've also heard, and this is somewhat exactly what Alan said as well, who's drawn to the movement is really important to pay attention to. But also, what's the changing nature of that landscape and how we need to pay attention to that as well. And we've also heard about a logic model or a narrative that ties into the conversation of the history going back to 2008 and that crisis and how that set the context. We've heard about the failure of the left. We've heard about the contradictions in terms of postmodern culture and the changing cultural context. We've heard about the frustration of the status quo. We've heard about the false problems and culture war. We can go on and on and on. That, to me, were what I consider to be very important elements of tonight's presentations. Now I'm going to open it up to conversation from you and the questions you may have that you think are important to discuss and describe with the panelists. How are we handling the mic?
Lena has a mic that she's going to...
Is there somebody down with the mic?
Is this the one?
Yeah.
Okay.
That way people can say where they are, and the mic will be circulated if you have any questions.
So if you have any questions directly to any of the panelists, please address them. If it's an open one, please let us know it's an open question. Thank you.
My question is an open question. We know that technology is very disruptive economically, and that people who have had manual jobs, those jobs are disappearing. We're also hearing that climate change is causing drought in Africa now and will likely affect tropical countries, so that people will be moving because of famine. These change, well, I don't know, perhaps there's hope for climate change, but technology is not going to go backwards. What effect, or what's the future for the unemployed, or the people who can't work in a highly intellectual and technological world? And will this affect?
Is this gonna make the alt-right grow?
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm thinking.
So I'd like to speak to that if I can. So as much as I think there's a lot that I agree with what Alan was saying, but I think that one thing that I'm the more pessimistic person on the panel is that despite I think that there is growing sense that the moderates are maybe winning somewhat. But I don't know if that's necessarily a positive thing, because if you think about it, and Oscar was talking about this quite well, you were both talking about this quite well, about what are the things that attract people to the alt-right. And I think that a lot of that has to do with the kinds of despair, depression, deprivation that we've seen rising as a result of what we now call neoliberal capitalism. And this is the kind of capitalism that's come after the period of the social welfare state, beginning roughly around the 1970s, let's say, in processes of what we call deregulation, which, and I don't like the term deregulation, which is often referred to, getting rid of the red tape and whatnot, because what we're talking about politically in terms of policy is really not the elimination of rules and laws, but the changing form of regulation, changing regulation from the public interest to regulating in terms of private individuals, private wealthy corporations and so forth, financial corporations and so forth. Now, I think combined with the changing structures of regulation that encourage more austerity programs, for instance, defunding public and social programs that, in fact, people rely on not just when they're in bad times, but also they help to subsidize our everyday costs of living so that we actually do have some money to spend on other goods that are out there in the market as part of the consumer society. Now, it comes to the question of automation, right? The process of automation. This has historically been a part of modernization within capitalism. That because of, and it's not because of, the problems of, individual capitalists who are just out and greedy and ready to go and, stagnate the entire workforce. What happens is because of a process of competition with other capitalists, every individual capitalist is forced to find a way to cheapen their production process so that they can return more profit than their competitor, right? And one of the ways that that's been done is by bringing in machinery to, if not necessarily replace workers, at least to de-skill workers to cheapen the cost of labor. So I think that part of the issue here is that combined with the with lowering wages or unemployment, that combined with the elimination of social and public programs that help to subsidize people's everyday costs of living, and in fact creates, in some ways, create more money for people to spend in the market. You not only have a structural crisis of capitalism, and I say a structural crisis of capitalism because even if you can cheapen the production process in aggregate, then that means that workers who are also consumers don't have any money to go out and spend in the market. This is what I mean by a crisis of effective demand in the market. It creates a structural crisis for capitalism, as well as if you remove through austerity mechanisms the things that help to support people in times of depression and unemployment and so forth, then you have a lot of depressed and deprived and depraved people who are going to be very upset and very angry, and they're going to want to find an answer, a solution that can help them. And this is why I say that this is a failure of the left, because against this is the status quo. I'm talking about the neoliberal regime, the moderate type of response. I think that this is a failure of the left because it's been shown time and time again to be impotent in being able to present a viable alternative to the existing system. And in the face of the status quo being hit with constant contradiction, in the face of the left being unable to galvanize or mobilize or create a viable alternative, what folks are left with is nothing but these forms of fundamentalization in the forms of alt-right or other forms of reactionary right-wing or types of groups. So from my perspective, if we're going to try to deal with the type of problems you're talking about in terms of automation, I think that we have to think more about the potential alternatives to the existing status quo.
I can certainly out-pessimize you, Matthew, if you really want to spend a few hours together. What I was really trying to say, looking at the great broad sweep of all sorts of trends of the last 70 years or so, since let's say the second, is that the world is a very, very complicated place, and it may well be that it's becoming more complicated even as we speak. Globalization makes us all more and more interdependent. I recognize that there are great imminent catastrophes awaiting the human race. You know that. We all know that. The question is, what do we do about it? Certainly it's true that there are mental health problems created by our economic system. But let's understand this, and that is that no one seems to have a sense of an alternative. We can talk about solar panels solving the problem of the endless use of greenhouse gases, but that's still a long way away. We can talk about all sorts of other solutions potentially, but it's not easy to see how we can sort of change things terribly radically, quickly. It may well be that indeed, given what is before the human race, we should try to systemically and radically change the way we live. It's just that there seems to be no great systematic alternative available. Now, Matthew, of course, as a Marxist, believes that some kind of socialism or communism is in our history. It's part of... I'm not rebating you. I'm basically saying what I think is your claim, and that is that there must inevitably be a solution to this problem. I would take a much more small c conservative, I hope this doesn't make me an alt-righter, a more conservative view that steady as she goes, let's be careful, let's look at things as they go, piece by piece, and try and do something, because otherwise, if you like, if it all falls apart, it falls apart radically, and there may not be anything but chaos, anarchy.
Okay.
Is not the last word. Both of them definitely answered your questions, but I just wanted to give you a small perspective. This is a fantastic book, and I'm an ardent follower of Professor Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Sapiens, I'm referring to. So his, it is kind of famous, but even he wrote later on Homo Deus, the second or the sequel. So there he portrayed a future of the world where exactly he alluded to your question that the technology would really diminish the requirement of physical labor. Virtually, I mean, there won't be that huge labor force that now China, exploits, or India has. So that kind of future is already there, and the trajectory of our human civilization is set to that course, and it is kind of unavoidable. But exactly, what should we do now, and what should be done in the future? That is the bigger question. And coming back to our theme of today's evening, that whether we see a large pool of angry young white men in the future, maybe, but those who are in the policy-making level, in the academia, research, should really think about dealing with this situation in the future. I don't have any clear-cut solution to that, but I do see the future is leading to that point.
Matthew, you want to respond to that?
No, I just wanted to take a couple of seconds to respond to Alan. I feel like we've got like a form of our political debate. No, what I wanted to say was that I think that there are things that are worth preserving within the model of political or social liberalism. I think that, and the way that I view things is in terms of contradiction. The main contradiction that concerns me is the one between the liberal democratic model, or even the social democratic model, and the structural flaws of the capitalist economy. And what I mean by it is this. I think that within liberalism, there is a strong will towards equality. That within liberalism, there's a huge desire for have racial equality, or have equality between the sexes, or some form of equity in terms of the classes. What I think is difficult to see from the perspective of a liberal view is the way that that desire for equality is contradicted by the necessity for inequality within the capitalist economy, in the sense that capitalism and the form of profit that emerges out of capitalism cannot come about without the exploitation of labor, and that because it requires the exploitation of labor, it needs to in some way, and I don't mean in a dubious way, but systemically, requires the reproduction of a pool of cheap exploitable labor, which is often one of the reasons why we see forms of systemic racism and sexism, which help to reproduce steady pools of cheap labor. Because of the need for exploitation within capitalism, you cannot escape the inequality that persists. And this is what I think fails to be viewed from a liberal or a social liberal perspective. So if I can, I don't know if people have seen the new Star Wars movie, but one of my favorite lines from the movie is that one of the characters says, "We're going to win because we're not going to fight what we hate, we're going to protect what we love." And I think that if liberals want to protect what they love about the equality of liberal democracy or social democracy, even that element of equality, in order to protect it, I think it's necessary to try to, in some ways, eliminate the reproduction of artificial inequality that is inherent to the capitalist mode of production. And I will add to this, I think that the difficulty here, and why I think that it's been problematic in coming up with some kind of viable alternative, because at the same time that let's call it a Marxist left, which is the perspective I'm talking about, wants to preserve the desire for equality within liberalism, in the process of trying to eliminate the inequality and exploitation of capitalism, it's been very difficult to realize a solution that maintains the same level of productivity and wealth production. And I think this has been the reason why there has not been a model that has been viable. But I don't think that the experiences of the 20th century socialism or communism, as deplorable as they are, I don't think that should dismiss the fact that we are facing imminent problems because of things like automation, because of things like ecological catastrophe, and because of the violent reaction of forces like the alt-right. I think that this situation forces us even more to become much more imaginative and creative, and to think of, if not necessarily big revolutionary transitions, at least small changes that we can make within the given system, such as not tax reform in the right sense, but reform in the sense of eliminating things like loopholes that are granted to the super wealthy, like, for instance, things like legal annual deferments on corporate taxes, or fighting back against the offshoring of tax money and using the resources that are actually there to invest in social and public programs that do subsidize people's everyday costs of living.
Okay. Good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Let's move on to the audience. Next question.
It is extremely bad to then be smug and dismissive of those angry young white men, the way Hillary was, and I believe the word was deplorables, that she used in dismissing these sort of backwoods yahoos. And so when I hear them talk about elitism and that smugness of the liberal middle class or upper class, I see it all sort of coming to a head. And I'd like to know if I'm reading it right or if I'm way off base.
Who would like to address that one?
Yes, I agree with you. And I try to allude to essentially what you say in the final comment I made, and that is that many of the ideas of white nationalism have to be thought of as a spectrum rather than, if you like, small section of the extreme right. It is then that, as I say, segregationists in the American South, if you like, privately will be very sympathetic to many of the things that you're saying. It might well be that traditional Republican women don't particularly like feminism, for example, and so the anti-feminism of the alt-right has a kind of resonance in their thinking. I would imagine, though, I haven't looked at these things lately, but I would imagine, though, that an opinion poll of most Americans, an opinion poll of Americans, would find a kind of liberal majority on almost all of these things. However, it is that Trump can put together a coalition of at least 46%. Wasn't that his vote in the election 2 years ago? So it is that the United States is in many ways a very traditional society. in regards to issues like, well, the role of religion in society, women's liberation, feminism, gay liberation, all sorts of other things, particularly of a cultural nature. So it is that, well, I think Matthew alluded to the existence of the cultural wars in the United States. It's a deeply divided society around standards, norms, values, and so on. But I think you're right then, that there's a certain kind of secret appeal that many Republicans and people of the central right find in the alt-right position.
It's an excellent observation. And last weekend I was reading a Washington Post article. A scholar from a renowned US university, she was trying to make a difference of the situation that we have now. So according to her observation, she was saying that it's a populism or populist movement. And there are much difference of 1930s world and 2017 or 2015's world. So fundamentally, what is different is in 1930s, the institutions, democratic institutions were not that resilient or strong. Economic institutions failed, the depression occurred, and the society or the institutions gave away the space where this kind of fascist organization like Hitler's and Mussolini's popped up. So according to her observation, there are fundamental differences now that we have. However, as I was alluding to in my concluding remarks, that I am not very complacent about the strength or resiliency of the democratic institutions that we have. And I'm going back to your observation, you are absolutely right. What is strikingly different that we have now is the power of communication through the social media and the internet. We can mobilize people, we can say whatever we would like to say. Freedom of expression, and if it is filled with hate, then it becomes dangerous. Alexander Bissonnet's social media account, if you have some idea, is full of hate. And look what hate can cause. So I'm not very complacent and very secure about institutional security and others that we have. And I would really agree with you that we have to really think deep and possibly do something so that these institutions that we are very proud of in Canada become more strong and more resilient so that it can weather these kind of effects.
Yeah, well, just to add to what, well, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. And I think that it's a very important observation. And before he was sort of defamed, Aziz Ansari went on Saturday Night Live, and it was kind of weird response to the election of Trump, where the silent majority of white racists were like, we don't have to be racist anymore. We don't have to, there was this weird sort of odd jubilation at this. No, but I think you're absolutely right, and I think that the worst possible way to respond to the silent majority is through acts of kind of moralism, right? And I think you were talking about this too, that there's this kind, and I was in a way talking about it too, that there's this kind of, on a version of the left, what I was calling social justice warriors, right? There's a kind of reaction to the ultra-white nationalism or racism, misogyny of the alt-right. The reaction is a kind of a moral response. And I think that even prior to the rise of the alt-right, this is one of the reasons why much of the working class has moved more towards the political right, because they don't feel the same kind of moralism that's coming from the liberal and the left.
Let's be careful about making the economy the sort of substrate that makes sense of everything else. It is that fascism in Italy preceded the Depression. Germany had the greatest experience of the Depression and gave us Nazism. Britain also had a fairly strong and deep expression of the Depression, did not in any way go fascist, nor did the United States. There was Charles Lindbergh in 1940, but he was defeated. It's also that there have been other kinds of, if you like, racialist excrescences within the political system. Think of George Wallace in 1968. But in the end, it went nowhere.
Thank you. Karina?
One last comment.
One last comment. Very quick.
Very quick. I want to emphasize that as much as I'm talking about capitalism and the economy, my point is not to make economy the deterministic factor by which we can analyze all these things. In fact, what I would say is that it's really politics and policy and those who have the most power in making policy that then have an impact on how the economy is organized and run, and lead the way to the symptoms that I'm referring to. It's a political problem. It's the political economy, not just the market.
Karina, please.
Silent majority is something that worries me too. But I'm going to add, it's not just that, or my view is not just that some people feel reflected in that silently and just go along. I think there is a group that will be silent just not to be bothered or not to stir the waters. And as a child of parents who lived through Nazism, they stayed there because that couldn't happen there, that wouldn't happen there, it wouldn't develop. And then I grew up, people looking at me and said, but why did they say, didn't they know? So we're so wise afterwards, looking at why did people not know, why did that happen? And what really touches me is, am I complicit? Am I, like, at a very personal level, are we, to what extent, looking at this and just intellectualizing it, are we allowing this to mushroom out of control? So, and we may well be, I don't know, and me speaking may not change anything, but that's something that worries me a lot.
Can I add something to Karina's statement? The question, I think, is what's the role of the citizen in this conversation? What do we do?
We're not worried enough, I think. That's where I come from. I am worried. I'm communicating.
So what's your recommendation in terms of us as citizens? What role do we play?
Yeah.
What do we do practically around this conversation? Any of you? Who wants to go? We're asking for solutions right now.
Practical solutions. Well,
They're academics, you know.
Or some ideas you may have about.
well, look, I mean, I remain an unrepentant and rather bad social democrat, and I believe that social democracy of different kinds is the way to go. So I will sort of think about voting NDP or Liberal next election. I will try and give money to, important people that are doing things. As much as I have time, I will somehow, put my shoulder to the wheel and try and be a force for good. But look, I have a 10-year-old daughter to look after and all sorts of other things. Matthew, he was dealing with a wife who was coming home from work at the last minute, and he had children to look after. And so on. So look, I mean, it's obviously true that for all of us, we have to be sort of watchful and vigilant, and we have to be committed. The question is, how do we do it? We can do it politically, we can do it through sort of civil society organizations, various kinds of initiatives and so on. There's always the restraint of time, but anyway, I think there is an important role for the exercised citizenship of all of us.
Thank you. Matthew?
In fact, when I was working on my book project, I realized that, especially in Canada, the whole research that is not really has not addressed the question of right-wing extremism to the extent that other societies have already done it. And of course, when I was talking to the participant from the Life After Hate group, and I further realized that this kind of deep conversation, and I'm a qualitative data analyst, and I love qualitative analysis. So this kind of engagement is rather very poor in Canada. And if you even Google and search, you won't find more than 2 or 4 articles written exclusively on right-wing extremism and right-wing political groups, as the name that I mentioned in Canada. These are very poor and very understudied. So, for me, if you ask me, I would like to really get into further research to understand this kind of phenomenon in Canada.
Thank you. Matthew?
I think that practically, being in a forum like this is important. And I'll say that because I think that one of the biggest problems that could allow something like this to persist is not criticizing it, but understanding its root causes. I think that, number one, it's important to understand what is the root cause of the growth of something like the alt-right. So learning and talking in a safe space. And I say safe space because I do recognize that we're living in a time, and we have lived in times, many of us have lived in different times, where we can feel vulnerable about expressing our dissent, right? So I think that at the very least, I think in terms of citizenship, it is important to learn and understand and engage minimally in trying to build knowledge resources, to learn about it. If you're comfortable, if your comfort level allows this, then to speak with other people about it, your friends, your family. Pesach is on the way. I plan on speaking about it with all of my friends, my new friends and family here in Winnipeg, who are very open and welcoming, I'm happy to say. I agree with Alan, oddly, here, that I think I know. As flawed as I believe many of the mainstream political parties are, I think that you have to do whatever you can to move towards some kind of progressive change, which for me would include, and I'm not a spokesperson for them, but it would include voting for a left political party or a social democratic party like the NDP. And that's, given the rightward shift that occurs, you have to try to shift the pendulum back whatever way you can. But I guess the general point I want to make is that depending on your comfort level and your feelings about your own safety and security and the safety and security of your family, which I do think are important points to make given the climate, and especially given historical concerns over anti-Semitism, not just in terms of graffiti, but actual violence done to and of course not just the Jewish community, because of the large amounts of hate towards the Muslim community or the LGBTQ plus community. I think depending on people's feelings of comfort and security, anything you can do, learning, voting, participating in some other kind of forum for discussion to think about and imagine and create ideas for policy shifts, policy alternatives. That's how I saw it.
Thank you. I think before I turn over to Marianne, two things I want to mention in terms of some practical solutions. There are groups around the world who are focusing on deep democracy, and they are working on the tools of engaging the disengaged. There's a project in Winnipeg and also in Stockholm right now, which I'm a part of, is trying to bring people together to ask the question, if you are disengaged, why? And do you want to be engaged? And where do you want to be? And that's been an interesting and enlightening process. The second thing that I think it'd be great for you to look at in terms of your research, there's an international working group on national values. I'm a part of it. And there's quite a bit of work now being done around the world in terms of how we start measuring and understanding how we change the value set in countries. Canada is moving very quickly to the right in terms of the value set. And that's happening in other countries in the world. And there are some models that have identified, by using the value set, it is identified when countries are starting to look at imploding. Trump, the notion about Trump, the values conversation that took place 10 years ago identified the US was on its way in that direction. Iceland, before it imploded, through the values models, identified it was about to implode. So there are some other tools and processes. And part of the work that I'm involved in is looking at how you bring values to the conversation and use them as the tools of engagement. So I'd like to thank you, and I'd like to turn this over to Marianne. Thank you.
Certainly on behalf of my co-chair Adina and myself, and I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. I hope you appreciated what we had here. I certainly did. I certainly want to thank our panelists, Alan Mill, Elder Ahmed, Matthew Footsetter, and of course our moderator, Art Nisco. I don't think that this presentation was in any way just a simply informative one. It was beyond that. It was stimulating. It was thought-provoking. But I know I've gained an understanding of how ideologies impact on the societal stage as a whole, and certainly as an individual, and also, as Karina said, how we can engage to move our society in better directions. Again, thank you all for coming, and I hope that you will join us for refreshments in the social hall. And thank you.
Before you go, Marianne, thank you for your good work. We can all agree that, at least in this, we both deserve something